Sometimes, I hate that this country has 4 seasons. Just when I'm finally starting to forget, an autumn wind reminds me of a whispered insult. Winter skies bring back cold and lonely memories. And in summer, when the sudden evening storms arrive, I'm torn apart with every clap of thunder. Again and again, until there's nothing left. 1 year after my mother's relapse, things had quieted down. The commotion at the hospital created a bit of a stir around town, but it didn't take long for the talk to trickle to a halt. For one thing, the main character in the story was no longer a resident. And even our cold-hearted country gossips seemed hesitant to turn a gravely ill woman's condition into one of their nasty little jokes. I was absent from school for a week after the incident, recovering from the shock and a mild case of pneumonia. But my life eventually returned to its normal rhythm. That would be the superficial summary, at least. The trauma of reading that magazine article led to a dramatic downturn in my mother's condition. She was now suffering from acute memory loss. Her physician, my grandparents, my father, and me, we were all strangers to Mom now. Everyone she met slipped out of her mind within minutes. These symptoms were far beyond anything a local hospital was equipped to handle. Soon after the incident, Mom was transferred to a specialized psychiatric institution in North Kanto. Ironically enough, that divorce never actually came to pass. Perhaps my father backed off out of concern for his public image? That, or it was part of some conditional legal arrangement. I don't know. One thing, however, was perfectly clear. The connection between the Sakaki and Kawamoto houses had been severed. My two families spent the first months after the incidents squabbling by proxy about legal issues and the care of their mutual burdens. In the end, the Sakaki continued to cover my mother's medical expenses, but they were no longer providing supplementary support to the Kawamoto family's floundering business.
美佐子の件だけは責任を取らせたけど、これで支援もなくなって。どうするつもりですか、あなた。
つつましくやっていけばなんとかなる。すまんが、しばらくは我慢をしてくれんか。
歴史のある川本の家がこんな粗末な生活をするようになるなんて。しかもあの子の面倒まで見なければいけないなど、こんなバカな話がありますか。
まったく、なぜこんなことになってしまったのかな。
Even long after the matter was settled, my grandparents never seemed to tire of moaning about the unfairness of it all. And of course, as the easiest target for their bitterness, I once again found myself wedged between a rock and a hard place. I had the bare minimum required for a normal life. They always kept up appearances after all, but not a day went by when I didn't hear their sarcastic, scornful words from the shadows. I went to a silent school and returned to a silent home. I'd lost my refuge. I'd lost my hope. All I could do was suffer quietly. This would be the point where a normal person might go bad. But I had been living inside a cage for so long that not even that choice was available to me. There was a time, just once, when I tried approaching a group of girls with that sort of reputation. The result was pathetic. In that country town, even the delinquents were mindful of appearances. They turned their backs on me and walked away without a word. Shunned by even those lowest on the totem pole. For a long moment, I just stood there, rooted to the spot. And then I found myself looking up into the sky. It looked no different from the day I'd gazed out the window with my mother. Had Mom always been alone? Was that why she'd spent so much time watching something that never really changed? Now that I was well and truly isolated, I'd begun to think more about her feelings.
泣くこともできないのね。
It seemed like a moment worthy of a little sobbing, but it just wasn't happening. On that day in the rain, I'd used up my lifetime's supply of tears. All that was left was a parched, withered husk of a human being. For one long year, I did nothing but watch the sky change slowly over me. But soon enough, I was pulled down into the muddy stream once again. It was a little before the start of summer vacation. Our teacher had fallen ill that afternoon. The final lesson was replaced by a study hall, in which I had spent gazing dully outside the window. With that exercise in pure boredom finally complete, I was walking sluggishly down the road toward my grandparents' house, just turning the final corner onto our street.
あれ
Something was wrong about this picture. A shiny black luxury car was parked along the thickly hedged road in front of our house. The Kawamoto family didn't own a private automobile. My grandfather apparently had one back in the days when the business was doing well, but it was one of the first things to go when the recession hit. The negotiations with the Sakaki family had always been held in the business office by the station, so it was hard to imagine why such a car could have possibly come.
誰だろ
For a little while, I dawdled outside, staring curiously at the car with its thickly tinted windows. But after 2 or 3 minutes, a voice called to me from inside our house.
遅かったじゃないの、由美子ちゃん。早く上がって。
え
I was startled. The friendly attitude was one thing, but it was the very first time since I'd arrived that my grandmother had called me by name. She wouldn't have done that without a very good reason.
はい
After quickly removing my shoes, I let her usher me into the parlor. It was the first time in a good 4 years that I'd been in that room. The instant I crossed the threshold, 5 men in black suits stood up simultaneously and bowed in greeting. As I blinked in bewilderment, my grandmother spoke, a strange little smile twisting her face.
ほら、そこに座って。由美子ちゃんが話に入らないと進まないことなんだから。
And with that, she sat me at the head of the table. The dusty air of the rarely used parlor tickling my nose, I looked around me. All 5 of the men had deeply serious expressions on their faces. To be honest, I wanted nothing more than to run away.
一体何の話なんですかこんな急に
As soon as the question left my mouth, a man seated to my left took control of the conversation.
お父様、榊道明様の命により、由美子様をお迎えに上がりました。
お迎えに
はい。お父様は昨年の一件で、由美子様をとても心配していらっしゃいました。それで、こうしてお迎えに上がった次第です。
What on earth was this man talking about? After the incident with Mom, my father hadn't shown up in this house even once. I understood that he had a busy professional life, but he didn't even bother to send a message or place a phone call. Now they expected me to believe he was worried? Now, after a full year? Ridiculous. It was mystifying Grandma had even let them in the house, let alone with that simpering grin on her face. Didn't she understand this was nonsense? But soon I discovered that my grandmother's reactions were perfectly lucid, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of that.
よかったわね、由美子ちゃん。これでいい学校に通えるし、お父様とも一緒に住めるのよ。
いろいろあったが、これからは何の心配もしないで暮らせるんだ。よかったな。
お父様からもまたこの家を助けていただけるそうで、本当によかったわ。
Ah, now I understood. This was a question with no choices. My grandparents had decided the answer beforehand, and were now unilaterally forcing me toward it. I was so profoundly astonished at their naked self-interest that I couldn't even manage any anger. But it's not as if snapping at them would have achieved anything in the first place. Remaining with them was probably never really an option.
わかりましたすぐに準備をしてきます
When I stood from my seat, my grandmother spoke in a sickeningly sweet voice.
あらあら、そこまで急がなくてもいいのよ。榊家の方は明日もまたいらっしゃるというし、それまで。
いえ結構です今いらっしゃってるのなら その車に乗っていきます。
あら、そうなの？由美子ちゃんがそう言うのなら仕方ないわよね、あなた。
ああ、もちろんそうだ。由美子のいいようにすればいいからな。
I was about ready to vomit. From my grandmother's words, it seemed clear the Sakaki had come with a clear offer in hand. My return, in exchange for restored financial support to the Kawamoto business. My grandparents had considered me a burden from the start, so I imagine they didn't exactly hesitate. It probably felt like selling some piece of junk from the backyard for a huge sum at auction.
汚らしい。
I tried muttering the words, but couldn't manage much conviction. After all, I was scuttling around the same sordid web. How could I complain? I wasn't working for my food. I pulled all the clothes out of my chest of drawers, threw them onto my tatami mat, and scowled down at them.
さようなら。
I wasn't speaking to my grandparents, the house, or even my mother. It was a farewell to the person who had lived here, idly wasting day after empty day, accomplishing nothing but growing older. I spoke those words to confirm a simple fact. That room was nothing to me. It held nothing of me. One by one, I cut the clothes I'd worn in the place to shreds. The expensive-looking children's clothes I'd bought with me. The generic ready-made supermarket clothes my grandparents had bought me when the need arose. My middle school uniforms. My face, an emotionless mask, I carefully chopped them into tiny pieces.
これで終わり。
My preparations were complete. Grabbing the scrap clothes with both hands, I shoved them right back into my chest of drawers. It took less than a minute to toss my everyday belongings, art supplies, and sketchbooks into my bag. Just like that, my life in that place was over. I didn't look back. After a stiff, formulaic goodbye to my grandparents, I dropped by my school for brief formalities, then began the journey home. Of course, I hadn't seen that home in many years. I had only the vaguest memories of the house itself. I was sincerely happy to be leaving my grandparents behind, but that didn't make me any less uncertain about the new life being thrust upon me so abruptly. The car headed north at high speed, moving from the coastline into the outskirts of the metropolitan area. We were heading for the heart of West Tokyo.
あと、どれぐらいで着くのですか？
An elderly man who had introduced himself as the chief of the clerical department at my father's company was behind the wheel.
車が混んでいなければ、あと30分もすれば着くかと存じます。
Glancing briefly at his GPS screen, he answered my question in a calm tone.
そうですか。
60 kilometers, as the crow flies. That was the distance from my grandparents' house to that of my father. In the end, my mother had never managed to return to a place less than an hour away by car, and I myself was only coming back on someone else's power. I didn't have the slightest idea what was coming next. I wasn't particularly hopeful, but I didn't feel much in the way of despair either. It would be enough if I could just spend my days quietly until I finally became an adult. With that thought, I closed my eyes and waited for the car to arrive at its destination. Just as the chief secretary had told me, we reached my new home about 30 minutes later.
大きい。
The house was very different from the patchwork image I had sewn together from fragments of my childhood memories. Far more magnificent than I remembered it. From the outside, the building itself looked like a Western-style mansion straight out of a manga. The spacious gardens were surrounded by high wall. The grounds were covered in so many tall, beautiful trees that it could have been a park. I had hazy memories of those things, but after years in the country, their scale and magnificence took me by surprise. But on an emotional level, the sight left me cold. My father's actions were one thing, my obedient return at his whistle was another. No matter how splendid the house might have been, when I thought about the foundation it was built on, my thoughts naturally took a turn for the bitter.
お母さんと戻ってこられたら。
I whispered the words to myself, too softly for the driver taking my luggage from the trunk to hear. Passing through a finely wrought metal gate, I returned to the house I spent my first years in. The uninspiring luxury was all the more pronounced inside the house itself. As I took off my shoes and looked around the gleaming entrance hall, I heard footsteps approaching from a side passage.
由美子、戻ったか。大きくなったな。
It probably would have taken me some time to recognize the person standing in front of me, if not for the recent photograph I had seen in a certain magazine 1 year before. Face to face with my father for the first time in what felt like decades, I saw a middle-aged man with a reasonably healthy complexion, but a subtle hint of something like gloom in his eyes.
ただいま戻りました。
As I lowered my head in a polite bow, my father continued in the same cheerful tone.
どうした？声に元気がないじゃないか。車に長い時間乗ったから疲れたのか。
I was more taken aback than anything else. Considering the way he had treated Mom and me up until that point, his aggressively friendly attitude was incomprehensible. From what I could remember, my father and I had only spoken a bare handful of times when I was a child, and certainly never like that. His motives weren't clear to me, but the sudden attempt at intimacy was off-putting. I didn't quite know how to respond to it.
大丈夫です。ちょっとお部屋に戻って休みます。
For the moment, I just wanted to cut the nauseating conversation short.
ああ、わかった。由美子の好きなようにするといいよ。
失礼します。
With another bow to my father, I made my way past him, heading for the one part of the house I remembered well. My very first place of refuge, the bedroom in which I had spent so many hours as a young child. I climbed the stairs and found my room without the slightest hesitation. Remembering its location so exactly prompted a brief swell of nostalgic emotion, but that soon gave way to that reoccurring sense of disgust. My memories there weren't exactly happy in their own right. The room I entered for the first time in years was so completely changed that I couldn't help raising my voice in surprise. The badly mismatched desk and bed had been cleared away. In its place was a complete arrangement of fancy furniture and pretty little luxury items, exactly the sort of things that might appeal to a girl of my age.
わざわざ揃えたのかしら。
Every part of the decor seemed as if it could have come straight from the set of a movie. The room was filled with fragile, ephemeral things. It felt as though they'd disappear like soap bubbles if I actually touched them. Normally they would have made me happy, but at the moment, it seemed like a hollow gesture.
お母さん、帰ってきたわよ。
Sitting on my bed, I murmured those words to myself. I'd finally managed to return to that house, but my mother wasn't with me. All I had there was a forced, artificial welcome from the man who had broken her. Would I simply resume the same numb, miserable life in a different setting? Staring up at the ceiling, I could feel the familiar jet-black sludge going thick inside my chest. I fought down the crushing feelings of despair as best I could, closed my eyes, and fell asleep. The next day, my father had arranged beforehand for my transfer into an all-girls school some 20 minutes from the mansion by car. It was a very prestigious institution. I'd actually recognized the name. I felt badly out of place, uncomfortable with my new uniform in the beautiful school building.
ねえ、あの子が。そうよね。榊家の。
I could hear the whispers from all sides. Entering the classroom, I sat quietly at an open desk as far from the others as possible. There was an improvement in one regard. The talk about me wasn't particularly cruel or hostile.
訳ありなのよね。ええ、ちょっとお近づきには。
But essentially, I was treated just like before. My classmates interacted with me in a business-like way when necessary, and otherwise largely pretended I wasn't there. A school full of young ladies from upper-crust families was surprisingly uncomfortable in its own way.
いい天気。
Having completed my formulaic introduction and the first day of classes, I found myself instinctively heading for the rooftop. After gazing up for a moment, I settled down against the concrete support near the edge of the roof and took out my sketchbook. I began to draw the sky above me. A simple pencil hatching, rendering the clouds and sky in shades of gray. That afternoon, I couldn't stand to look at the world. Anything my eyes settled on repulsed me. That empty sky was the only thing I could bring myself to observe calmly. The driver held open the front door to the house for me. I was delivered to school and back. I didn't even have to open my own doors anymore. That extreme courtesy only intensified my discomfort.
お帰りなさいませ。
The household employees greeted me with smiles so soft and mild, it was slightly nauseating. When I answered with a brief nod, they began to bombard me with words in rapid succession, their tone eager and openly professional.
由美子様、何か召し上がりますか？いえ、結構です。部屋へ戻ります。
では何かお飲み物をお持ちしましょうか。
それも結構です。喉は渇いておりませんから。
それでは何かありましたらお申し付けください。
はい。
Climbing slowly up the stairs, I heaved a heavy sigh. Would they be putting on that sort of show every single day from now on? The deference was so transparently artificial that it was painful rather than flattering. Given my current position, it just might be possible to order them to stop acting like that. But I didn't know what repercussions that would have, especially if they were to report it to my father. I decided it would be best not to make waves at such an early stage. I've been able to postpone it for one day with excuses about my fatigue, but the time had come.
久しぶりだね。こうして由美子と食事をとるのは。
A glass of wine in one hand, my father turned a radiant smile on me.
はい。
Inside my head, I spat out the words, "It's the first time." From the moment I sat down in front of that luxurious dinner and my beaming father, I was immediately filled with a desperate longing to flee. I tried a little of the sautéed duck on my plate just to kill a few seconds, but it seemed strangely tasteless and without texture.
学園の先生から褒められたよ。転入する際の成績が抜群だったとね。これなら学校間のレベル差はほとんど関係ないとのことだった。
My father, still maintaining the same cheerful tone as the night before, complimented me at great length.
はい。
All I could manage was to nod and mechanically shovel the food placed in front of me into my mouth. Course after course, and I couldn't taste a thing. Had they even put any salt on these? It was like eating hunks of rubber. Carrying things to my mouth solely for the sake of chewing on them didn't make for a pleasant dining experience. Gradually, I began to ignore my plate in favor of frequent sips of water.
気持ち悪い。
The tasteless food, the dad's barrage of praise, and myself, sitting there passively just accepting it all. Everything about this scene made me sick. My emotions only grew darker with every passing minute. This was some bizarre whim of my father's. That, or a meaningless ceremony he was carrying out in pursuit of some hidden objective. What else could it possibly be?
由美子、髪はずっと伸ばしているのか？
I felt my breath catch in my throat. That summer day. The day when the heat had poured down on me like a rain of molten iron. The moment when I had clawed at my chest and hacked at my own hair in a spasm of self-loathing. It all came flooding vividly back.
はい。
I almost told him that I'd cut it short once. But what would be the point of explaining that to this man? It would only throw this little play into chaos. What on earth did my father mean by asking me a question like that? Why bring up the very thing that had always marked me as worthless?
そうか。とてもよく似合ってるよ。
My father, a smile on his face, spoke those words in a casual tone of voice.
由美子、
すみません。
Rising from my seat, I ran out of the room, both hands pressed tightly around my mouth.
おい、何か体に合わないものがあったんじゃないのか？
I could hear my father snarling at someone behind me, but I didn't have time to be worrying about that. Acid burned my mouth as I vomited the tasteless food out into the toilet bowl. None of it had the slightest flavor going down, but coming back up it was powerfully unpleasant. It seemed a bit unfair somehow.
何を勝手なこと。
Wasn't my sex the entire reason he'd cast Mom aside? What on earth was my father thinking? How could he say that? Why? He'd never even looked at me before. This had to be some kind of whim. He decided to play house for a while to appease his guilty conscience. Either that, or he needed to do so for some work-related reason.
ここもひどい。
How long would it take before I could find a safe haven? This was no better than living with my grandparents. No. In the countryside, at least, I wasn't expected to do anything. There were expectations of me here. That made it even more agonizing.
何もしたくないのに。
Tasting the acid rise once more from the depths of my throat, I descended into self-pity. I would truly have preferred to shut myself up in a dark shed, to reject the world and do nothing at all for the rest of my life. But so long as I needed food to eat and a bed to sleep in, I had no choice but to play along with my father's momentary kindness. The thought triggered a new wave of nausea. One week passed. People often say that time flies when you're having fun. Perhaps it's true, because those first 7 days seemed to last a century. Hanging my bag next to my desk, I pulled out my notes and textbooks. I was as isolated and out of place as ever in my new school. I'd been studying a good deal, but that was simply my way of killing the vast stretches of otherwise painfully empty time I spent there. It certainly had absolutely nothing to do with my father's praise. I hadn't sketched for a few days now. For one thing, the weather had been dull and gray, so I couldn't look up without remembering that day, and I just hadn't been in the mood in the first place. Even if I opened my sketchbook today, I'd only end up with another drawing of the sky, as if I didn't have enough of those already. Those vaguely self-mocking thoughts stopped me on the way up to the roof, redirecting my path down to the lower floor. My life was a steady line from one meaningless moment to the next. Identical days trickled by, but there was one thing that had begun to change in the course of that week. Human beings are frighteningly adaptable creatures. The meals with my father that had gradually repulsed me to the point of vomiting were now growing tolerable. Sometimes, I hated myself for that. But little by little, I was coming to understand that it wasn't just the result of my mind acclimatizing itself to the situation.
ユミコ、学校には慣れたか？
はい。
いきなりの転校で戸惑ったかもしれんが、すぐに友達もできる。お父さんの時もだな。
My father was making a genuine effort. With gentle advice and anecdotes about his own experiences, he tried to reassure me. Apparently, Dad had gone through many transfers in his student years, and always struggled with how to present himself to his new classmates. I was beginning to learn a number of surprisingly personal things about my father, as he persistently tried to draw me into conversation.
ああ、そうか。今は時代も違うだろうからな。すまなかったな、ユミコ。
いいえ。
And he wasn't pushy or arrogant about it. He always seemed to be considering my point of view. Just as I'd heard, Dad was on an extremely tight schedule. Even when he returned home, it was extremely rare for him to stay overnight. More frequently, he would return to his company immediately after dinner. But that also meant he was coming home solely to share a meal with me. I gradually grew less prickly and slightly more communicative. By now, I could eat dinner with him without a hint of queasiness.
どうしたユミコ？
いえ、なんでも。
Just as something was about to spill out of my mouth, Mom's pale, empty face had flashed before my eyes. I silently reminded myself, this man is responsible for my mother's suffering. That fundamental resentment hadn't faded. I wouldn't let it fade. Lying in bed in my darkened room, I thought things over. I was no less uncertain then than when I first arrived at that place. But the reasons for that inner turmoil were beginning to change. My father's attitude toward me was becoming harder to process. At first, I'd been simply disgusted by his overfamiliarity. But by that point, it was harder to dismiss as some bizarre game. Sometimes, I could almost take his friendliness at face value. Even that remark about my hair might have been intended as nothing more than a casual compliment. Such positive interpretations were beginning to seem plausible.
そんなの今更よ。
I tried mumbling negative words to myself, but the nagging doubts remained. My distant mother had grown kind when her condition improved. The situation was clearly different, but there was always the possibility my father had undergone a similar change in the years since I'd seen him last. Tossing and turning on my bed, I turned the questions over in my mind. I'd been so cold for so long, but little by little, I could feel something like warmth returning to my body. I'll just end up being betrayed again. This time will be different. With those two opposing answers battling indecisively in my mind, I waited for dawn to come. Hey everyone, J2 John Jeremy here. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to click on subscribe and the bell icon to ensure you're kept up to date on the channel. Until next time, so long and take care.